Hello, how are you? Welcome to the Laritas Podcast. I am your host, Mike Gathers. Join me as we explore the world of iconic writer Robert Anton Wilson, his reality labyrinth of ideas, and the many currents of influence running through them. Visit us at alaridaspress.com/podcast for show notes, links, and past episodes. And help us find the others by sharing, subscribing, reviewing. You know what to do. It helps more than you might think. In our last episode, I discussed Marshall McLuhan with director of the McLuhan Institute, Andrew McLuhan. In this episode, I discussed the father of information theory, mathematician, engineer, and cryptographer Claude Shannon, with his biographers Rob Goodman and Jimmy Soni, authors of A Mind at Play. Rob and Jimmy, welcome to the Laritas Podcast.
Thanks so much for having us on. Happy to talk to you.
Yeah. So we're here to talk about Claude Shannon, who you two have written a biography on. So maybe we just start with a little introduction on each of you and how you got to this project together.
I can start. I'm not a scholar of information theory or computer science. In my day job, I'm actually a political theorist. So I work on rhetoric and history of political thought. And before I got into academia, I was a speechwriter. So I come from a very different background than Claude Shannon and a lot of the people who work with him, of course. But when Jimmy approached me with the idea for this book, it sounded like a great thing to jump on, because it was a little bit outside my comfort zone, because we really tried to approach this project, as journalists rather than experts. But as journalists, what we were interested in doing was one, learning about Shannon's influences, his growth, his intellectual development, his impact, the communities that he worked in, the people he worked with, what his life was like. And two, explaining why what he did was so important to the information age and to computers and other technologies we take for granted in a way that people like us could get, in a way that kind of worked for lay people who weren't in that world. Because if you're in the information theory world, the computer science world, the engineering world, you certainly probably know who Claude Shannon is. You know a lot about his impact. You know that he's probably one of the heroes of that field. But for a lot of people outside that world, Shannon in many ways is sort of an unsung hero. He's someone who doesn't really get the recognition that we think his work merits. So we were really excited about learning about why he matters so much, and then trying to share that with people like us who come out of a more humanities or non-science background, but can still really appreciate the intellectual journey that Shannon was on. So it was a real pleasure.
Yeah, I would add also, this is Jimmy, I would add that he's also just a phenomenally interesting, fun, quirky person, kind of in the spirit of Richard Feynman. He built chess playing machines and robots and a lot of just kind of, his mind wandered in a really wonderful way. And we wanted to explore that side of him as well. The side that, he had basically revolutionized the entire field, but was also just a playful person throughout his career. And it was an interesting kind of juxtaposition, and we wanted to explore that part of his life as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. When I first started reading the book, your book, Richard Feynman popped in my head as just, like these two characters in the science world, but yet they were very different in their own way. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think I was going to say that you think about the connection between Shannon and Feynman. I think what they have in common is just a really promiscuous interest in so many different areas of their field. They were people who weren't really willing to stay bound in one little small niche, and the ability to carry things on from one field to another was really transformative for a lot of the projects they're both engaged in. Personality-wise, I think there's a huge difference. Feynman, I think, is famously known for being a charismatic, outgoing scientific celebrity. And Shannon, as we learned about his life, there was a period in which he sort of tried on that role and realized it didn't fit him. He was a much more retiring, introverted, closed door sort of person, which meant on the one hand that there are the sort of colorful Shannon anecdotes that there are about Feynman, but it also means on the other hand there's a lot to discover about him, a lot about his creativity and playfulness and passion for a lot of the fields he worked in that simply didn't get publicized the way that, say, a Feynman or a Buckminster Fuller or some of those other sort of mid-century scientific figures were able to self-publicize. Shannon really deliberately decided that that wasn't going to be the path he was going to take.
I would add too that I think that with Feynman and Shannon, you have people who are unafraid to look silly in the eyes of other people. And so there is a way in which, like, part of them being able to explore a lot of different domains is just a willingness to not really care what other maybe professionals in their field or more buttoned up scientist types would think. And you had people who criticized Shannon for kind of leaving formal electrical engineering and academic writing, but he was largely indifferent to those opinions. And you get the same sense from Feynman and from others that a lot of the curiosity that motivated their greatest breakthroughs was also the curiosity that led them to lock breaking or to card playing or to machine design. It all came from the same place, and I think that's really important. And it's one of the things we tried to explore with the Shannon biography.
Yeah, that seems to be one of the things that truly makes this guy fascinating, is he just let his mind wander, and wander it did. And he did so with that humility. And what came up for me at one point was like this beginner's mind kind of approach to things, where he didn't seem to let preconceived notions get in his way. Well, I wanted to appreciate what you said earlier, Rob, about just writing a book that would be presentable, writing a book as journalists that would be presentable. I have a chemical engineering background, and I don't pretend to be really strong in some of these areas of that Shannon was in. And I found your book really helpful in laying it out and explaining some of the technical things in a way that I could wrap my head around rather easily. And so really appreciate that. Well, so we've kind of touched on this, but maybe tell me if you were approached. I mean, Shannon flew under the radar for a lot of people. So let's just say, how would you say to a lot of those people what makes him interesting?
What makes Shannon interesting? Well, I'd say one of the things that makes him interesting is that he worked in so many different fields. He wasn't really someone to be pigeonholed for most of his life. So he was someone that had his start in electrical mechanical engineering. His master's thesis has been described as the most influential master's thesis of all time. And one of the things he did is he invented the basis of digital computing. The idea that you could use circuits that can represent states like on or off, the sort of basic binary state, 1 or 0. And you could use these to evaluate logical statements, which is basically part of the intellectual architecture of all modern computers we use, because what computers do is they evaluate logical statements using circuits, which in Shannon's time were sort of unwieldy mechanical circuits. These were sort of before the origins of the transistor and the chips that we're familiar with now. But he laid the basis of that. But then he went on to work all over the place. He worked in genetics. He worked in information theory, which was probably his most famous work. And he gave us things like the invention of the concept of a bit as a way of measuring information. And he also did so many fun, practical, playful, jokey things. Things like the famous flame shooting trumpet. One of the very first wearable computers, one of the very first chess computers, a whole arsenal and repertoire of accessories for juggling and riding pogo sticks. He was just the guy who really benefited from having the fun and intellectual and creative freedom to study the things that interested him and to work on the things that interested him. And he always did it, as we said, in a really unconstrained, creative, playful way. As Jimmy said, I think, and you also said, he was not really afraid to make himself look silly. And in the process of that, he really brought together some fascinating innovations, specifically in early computing information theory, that might not have been possible without someone of his caliber and his interests.
So, yeah, just thinking about this, it's still hard for me to wrap my head around all the different things, but I do see common threads. So his master's thesis, it was around integrated circuit design, right? And it seemed like it was a real hit or miss science, so to speak, at the time. Like there wasn't really a theoretical framework. They were just kind of cobbling computers together at a very basic level and seeing what worked and what didn't. And he saw this completely unrelated form of algebra and saw how it applied to integrated circuits and just created a whole theoretical framework for what we now know today. Is that inaccurate?
Yeah. What's really interesting is that Shannon, did this famous master's thesis in the 30s. I believe it was 1936 when it was published. In which, at the time, I don't think it was really expected that someone like him with an electrical engineering degree would have to take a course in logic. But he just happened to be in a course in logic in the philosophy class. In a philosophy class, he took the University of Michigan, where he was an undergraduate. And when he went on to master's work with Vannevar Bush at MIT, he brought this connection together, the connection between switches and circuits on the one hand, and Boolean algebra, the basis of evaluating statements on the basis of true or false or ones or zeros on the other hand. So the computer that Shannon was working on along with Bush was a massive analog computer. Rather than evaluating things in sort of an off-on state, it was essentially, you would evaluate equations by drawing the answer on a graph. So the speed at which the various components of the computer spun was connected to the essentially the problem you asked it to solve. And that's what made it an analog computer rather than a digital computer. But the neat thing about this computer was that one very small part of it functioned in a digital manner with a series of switches and controls that flipped on and off. And it was Shannon's job as a master's student working with Bush to manage and oversee and take care of this computer. But this is sort of when he made the connection between the switches, the digital part of the analog computer, which is sort of a sideshow to the main event, and his work on Boolean algebra. And that's what enabled him to figure out this connection between switches on the one hand and zeros and ones on the other hand. And in this famous master's thesis, Shannon didn't just posit this connection. He actually drew out some very basic circuit designs for arrangements of circuits that could make decisions and figure out logical statements on the basis of on or off or one or zero. So for instance, one of the ones I remember is a design for a very basic alarm system. But basically, it was a really influential proof of concept for how computers could do very complex, intellectually demanding things with the most simple possible set of components. Whatever it is that could either be on or off, or whatever kind of medium could have these two possible states. Shannon said basically you could evaluate any logical statement that was possible. If you had enough of those switches aligned correctly, you could do anything with them. And again, along with the work by von Neumann and others in this period, this is one of the just fundamental building blocks of the computers we still use here, including to record this podcast.
I just want to check in with Jimmy for a second. He dropped off and I didn't notice, but we've got him back on.
He says he's back on
Yep,
now.
I am back on.
Cool. All right, just checking in there.
Yeah.
Okay, resetting her. So again, it seemed like just kind of it wasn't like anybody was thinking about this algebra as a solution for integrated or logic circuits at the time, and he just happened to stumble into this. And there's that kind of out of the box thinking that seems to pervade his whole career. In fact, his PhD advisor sent him off to do a PhD on genetics. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the really interesting thing is that Shannon had zero background in genetics, just like he had zero background in computing before he started his master's thesis. So the fact that Bush wanted him to get involved in statistical genetics was really sort of a vote of confidence from a guy, Vannevar Bush, who was one of the most influential figures in the scientific establishment in that period, and would go on during World War II to be an advisor to presidents, to be the first national science advisor, to be one of the public faces of science, and probably most triumphant period in 20th century American history. So this is a guy, by asking Shannon to get into a completely different field, you're giving him a tremendous vote of confidence. What Shannon did was he went to a place called Cold Spring Harbor that had a tremendous library of genetic data. One thing we touched on in the book is the reason it was there is sort of there's sort of a dark backstory to it, which was that the collection of genetic data grew out of interest in eugenics. So there's essentially a eugenics laboratory or a eugenics data center at this laboratory. Shannon didn't really demonstrate any interest in eugenics, and by the time that he and Bush sort of came on the scene and started working on it, it was in the process of being discredited, especially because of the way that the Nazi regime in Germany used a lot of American and other eugenic thinking as part of its racist and genocidal policy. So eugenics is in the process of being discredited. But Shannon's not really interested in that. What he's really interested in is thinking about different ways to symbolize and do statistics with the genetics of population. So he's involved in population genetics and trying to make conclusions about, say you start off with a population of X number of turtles. Some of them have this kind of shell, some of them have that kind of shell. Given some constraints, what would the population of turtles look like 20 generations in the future? And Shannon developed his own system of notation and his own series of rules to make reasonable calculations about population genetics over time. Anyway, the thesis is the dissertation is successful. He earns his PhD from MIT, does it in just a couple of years. He chooses not to follow up on it, though. And actually, one of the interesting things we did in the course of the book was we followed up on people who've written about this thesis after Shannon became famous in another field. And they said that if he had stuck in genetics, he might have been as important in genetics as he ended up being in information theory. He was quite ahead of his time, but it kind of tells you a little bit about how important personal and professional networks are in science. Shannon's entire network was in fields like computing and electrical engineering. He just didn't really know that much in the genetics world, so he wasn't really successful or even capable of getting people in that world to pay attention to his insights and change that field the way he would go on to change engineering and computer science. Now, if he'd stuck in it, maybe that would have changed over time. But I think Shannon made an assessment that I think a lot of people make when they're coming out of grad school, which was, what's going to be the most efficient use of the time and the talents that I had. And he realized genetics wasn't really it. So, he's glad he did it for an intellectual exercise, didn't really publish it or make much of it. But then he was happy to get the PhD and to go on in a future, actually at Bell Labs, where he gets to pursue his more original passions for engineering.
Right. It seemed like his advisor was really steering him into just a completely different area as a way of just keeping your mind open to new ideas, new concepts. I mean, what I guess this leads me to think about throughout our conversation is he had this brilliant 6 steps to problem solving thing that came out.
Yeah, and, it's actually one of the more interesting and underrated documents that Shannon left behind. He wasn't someone like Feynman where he would have written a book, sort of, surely you must be joking, Mr. Feynman. But we found this speech that he gave about problem solving to a group at Bell Labs, where he sort of deconstructs different approaches that he takes to solving problems. And, this would sort of be like, I think the equivalent would be like, sort of Michael Jordan teaches you how to do a free throw, right? Or something like this is one of the world history's great problem solvers, kind of describing his approach. And by some accounts, it was sort of an awkward presentation because it wasn't like a formal speech. And at the end, he just kind of dives into a problem that he wants to solve with the group. But it is one of these kind of lasting relics that we were able to find and unearth and share a bit more broadly with the world.
Yeah, I love this. It really, I just read about it. So, and you're reminding me that you guys really just dug this up. So it's something that does seem like it needs more broadcast more in the world. Step one, simplify, simplify, simplify. There's a lot of talk in the entrepreneur space and the innovation space about first principles, going back to first principles. And that seems to involve just looking at the physics of the situation. It all boils down to physics, but
I'm still there, sorry.
It's all right, no worries.
Yeah.
But that's what comes up for me when we start out with simplify, is like question your assumptions and make sure you're all focused in on what the actual problem is and not getting caught up in tangents and extraneous data.
Yeah, Shannon was tremendously skilled at that, and that's a piece of advice he also gave to his students. Later on down the road when he took on some more mentoring roles. But in everything that we looked at, that he was a major pioneer in, and was an influential figure in. That's really something that he both appreciated and practiced it. When it comes to his work on information theory, what's really remarkable about that to people who came afterwards is that it's a tremendous work of simplification, stripping away all the extraneous stuff. And Shannon wants to study things like the qualities that make messages capable of being compressed, capable of being protected against loss, and so on. The things that are the basis of modern IT in the information age in many ways. He starts by asking, well, what can we say about messages in general if you completely abstract away their content? How can you think about and measure information if it's something like, as if it were something like a physical quantity that obeyed almost physical rules? And we don't want to suggest that Shannon was the only one thinking about information that way at the time. We talk about some of his influences and some of the ways in which his predecessors, especially at Bell Labs, had taken up this line of thought about talking about information like it's a physical property. But Shannon just really jumps on this and runs with it. And that's really where he made his biggest mark, and that tremendous simplification of saying, how can we talk about information, but also ignoring the content of messages? And there were very few, if anyone, thinking about information in those terms at the time that Shannon writes his famous paper.
Yeah, when you started covering that in the book, and he was looking at like the structure of language and the simplicity of it really blew me away. When I first started thinking about it, I thought, well, okay, there's language rules like I before E except after C, and then we're going to get, how do you encode that? Mm-hmm. But he took it just to such a greater level of simplicity. Like, okay, if you have a letter, how many times does the letter T appear? Period.
Right.
And then, if you have a T, how many times does the letter H appear after T versus K, for example?
Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you about the simplification that you mentioned. As I said, I was starting to look at Shannon's work as someone in a completely different field, as a political theorist. But I was able to, read and make sense of Shannon's papers, including his, famous 1948 paper. There's probably some of the more dense math that was a little bit over my head. But the basic point is that even someone with a basic education without background in that field can really watch as Shannon is walking you through the basic concepts of this field he's inventing from scratch, this field of information theory, in a way that's both really insightful, but also really accessible. And I think a lot of that has to do with the simplification. Just really stripping this down to nuts and bolts and saying, start from the very basic question of what do we mean by a bit? What is a bit? How does that allow you to measure information regardless of the content of the message that the information is carrying? And starting from that point, building up a really impressive system of thinking systematically about information. But as someone who is not coming from that world, I was really impressed with Shannon in his ability to distill and communicate some really difficult ideas in a way that even someone like me could get.
And it seemed like at some point it got carried away, where people were applying communication theory to all sorts of things, and he actually issued a statement telling the world to slow their roll a little bit on that.
There's this famous piece by Shannon called "The Bandwagon," in which he described just that this idea that people were using information theory as sort of a master discipline. Said, well, if we can just measure the information content in anything, what if we applied it to the history of literature, or to geology, or to religion, or who knows? And Shannon essentially says what you said: slow your roll in slightly more polite terms. But I think this says some interesting things about him. One, it says that he took the scientific rigor of what he was trying to do very seriously. He didn't like people popularizing it and applying it outside of its very specific domain, which was specifically in encoding and decoding messages. And where a lot of other pop science figures or public intellectuals in this period, and I mentioned Buckminster Fuller, for instance, as an example, I think because of just a biography came out on him recently, we're really happy to see their ideas popularized and even a little bit bastardized and taken up in a broader public in a way that sort of simplified them. That was never really Shannon's goal. He never really wanted to be the public face of anything or to be the public face of information theory. And even though information theory really had a kind of late 40s, early 50s vogue, Shannon took some deliberate steps to slow down its development as not as a scientific discipline, but as sort of a master metaphor or master narrative for understanding other parts of the culture. That just didn't seem serious to him, and he didn't really care about any kind of public claim that might have accrued to him as a result.
And I would go one step. I would go one step further and say he would frequently turn down opportunities to give talks, opportunities to do media. There was this kind of contrarian sensibility when it came to becoming famous. And there's this great line. Someone asks him later in life, someone asks him to come to some place to give a speech. They're willing to obviously pay. I think there might have been an award involved. And Shannon writes back and says, as we've gotten older, as he's referring to his wife, Betty, he said, as we've gotten older, we have a few rules. Betty doesn't do windows and I don't give talks.
It certainly seemed like, I think that was maybe one of the 11 life lessons that you presented in studying Shannon, is to kind of keep your inbox clean, or not keep it clean, but just minimize the inputs. And as his fame and notoriety spread, he was always getting awards and asked to talk, and just had to really close that off because it was a distraction from what he really wanted to do, was tinker and solve problems. That said, he won the Kyoto Prize. You want to tell us a little about that? Seemed like a pretty big deal.
Yeah, so he was sort of rolled out as sort of an alternative Nobel. And Shannon was one of the very early winners of this. And he went and sort of gave a speech summarizing his career and accepting this sort of capstone honor for his career in Kyoto, Japan, which was tough for him, by the way, because he was not really, he wasn't much of a world traveler. He was much of a homebody. Was such a meat and potatoes sort of guy that he had trouble eating Japanese cooking. So it was a whole thing for him. But I think the main thing is that, towards the end of his career, a lot of people recognized what a pivotal and transformative figure Shannon was, and really attempted to give him the honors that he deserved in that field. There's no real possibility of him winning a Nobel just because, the fields that he could conceivably have won it in, engineering or computer science or math, just aren't fields to happen to have a Nobel Prize. That's just sort of a random development of which fields got funded with Nobel Prizes. So that fields sort of outside the classic ones, I think the Nobel Prizes are being announced like this week, actually. The fields outside that kind of circle, found other sort of ways of honoring their luminaries. And Shannon winning the Kyoto Prize was sort of a capstone of what he had done as a luminary in the field of computing engineering.
And he was the first winner of that prize, is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that part of the reason that the organizers of the prize chose him for that is, I think when you are trying to roll out a new award, you oftentimes want to, you want to have sort of a high profile person to kind of vouch for it and justify this new thing you're rolling out. So I think when they were looking for someone who hadn't won a Nobel Prize but was Nobel Prize caliber, I think Shannon was a pretty obvious choice.
And then Shannon, as we've touched on, just tinkered in all sorts of ways. And you mentioned this, but I wonder if you could go into this more, the first wearable computer.
Yeah. So this is actually it's a really interesting part of his sort of post-information theory, tinkering and hobbies. After Shannon had pioneered this field working at Bell Labs, he was able to go on to MIT and then became a tenured professor there. And really because of his success in the field, he had a lot of carte blanche to work on things that interested him. Which some of the interesting results were because he wasn't sort of involved in the day-to-day at a place like Bell Labs anymore. He could really do things that were a little bit more blue sky, and he could do things that were a little bit the kind of things that would pay off for some time. But because at this point he was at the center of a network of a lot of people working in these areas, a lot of the ideas he came up with, like miniaturization, and his work on chess computing as well, go on to be really influential among people that you might not, sort of the second generation after the information theory came out. So he actually worked with a guy named Ed Thorpe developing this wearable computer to calculate blackjack odds, I believe. So they used it to essentially cheat at the Vegas casinos. And what it would do is it was roulette odds, excuse me. It would calculate where a roulette ball was likely to land based on where it started. It would give you a chance of beating the house because it could predict with better accuracy than random where that ball is going to land. So I think you'd carry the computer in your pocket and would actually give you input. It would play a tone based on the answer that you wanted through an earbud. So I think Shannon and Thorpe described wearing this to the Vegas casinos with some mishaps. I think at one point, I think they tried to conceal the earbud because this was an era in which no one had really seen an internal an inner ear speaker of the kind that kind of looked like little Apple AirPods today. So instead, it looked like there was an insect crawling out of his ear, so he had to kind of run away and go to the bathroom and conceal it again. But anyway, after doing this and doing quite well at the roulette tables, I think Shannon and Thorpe were sort of politely asked to leave, or maybe not so politely, by the casino management. And I think they took the hit and got out of there. But even though it didn't really lead to a lot of long-term gambling success for them, it ended up being, also another one of Shannon's influential projects, because in many ways, a lot of our kind of small wearable computers, or even phones that act as miniature computers, in many ways can look to Shannon's portable roulette computer as sort of a distant ancestor.
It's heartwarming to know the first wearable computer may have been used to cheat on roulette to beat the house.
That's really fantastic. Yeah, I love that. But that's just Shannon. He really he was an irreverent sort of guy, and I think the challenge of beating the house was really attractive to him. And I don't think he would have he would have said, well, I put so much work into this. It doesn't really count as cheating if I had to engineer the entire computer from scratch. I'm entitled to whatever winnings I get as a result. I'm not sure the casino saw it that way, but I would imagine that's how he would justify it to himself.
Nice. That's excellent. Mm-hmm. That's a great image. And the other image I have now in my head is a man roaming the halls of university on a unicycle juggling. I don't know what to say about that.
Yeah, I think it's actually connected to something that we found that was interesting about Shannon. Was there was a physicality to his pursuits. So he was an academic. He had published papers in journals, and he could kind of think with the best of them. But he also was a proficient juggler. He built unicycles and was a unicyclist. He would build machines, and so there was a kind of way in which he was working in the world of bits and the world of atoms. And it makes him a little bit different from some of the other people of the time, but also from our perspective, more interesting. The juggling and unicycling is, he does combine them at Bell Labs, and there are famous stories of him kind of roaming the halls. He also constructs his own fleet of unicycles and starts to miniaturize them down until he has one that's, I don't know, I think it was like a couple inches big, just for the joke, just for the humor of it, to see what it would look like. And so again, these are pursuits that there's some trace of all of that, even in the information theory paper that's published in the Bell Systems Technical Journal, right? This is somebody who is willing to allow his mind to even go to build a 2-inch unicycle if that's what it takes to understand something or make himself laugh.
The other one that sticks out is you flip a machine on, and the whole purpose of the machine is the hand comes out and turns itself off.
The ultimate machine. Yeah, that was a classic. Yeah, it was just it really, I think, captures this kind of puckish sense of humor that he had. That he and also we thought not to psychoanalyze too deeply, but there was something in there about the machine that wanted to just be left alone. Shannon had a bit that of his, that was a bit of his personality as well. As much as he enjoyed being a practical joker and being a trickster and being playful and doing things like riding down the hallway on the unicycle with juggling, he wanted this to be on his own terms. Certainly not an outgoing person, certainly a guy who did his best work in a really sort of quiet, lonerish sort of way. And I think not to go too far into psychoanalyzing, but I think he must have felt like that machine at times, especially as he sort of became a better known figure, both in his field and internationally, and sometimes probably just wanted to go tinker, which was his real passion ever since he was a kid.
There's something about the tinkering that strikes me in terms of just general problem solving. Like it's a man who seems to have an intuitive understanding of how things work and gets involved in different things. When he talks about fill your mental matrix with solutions to similar problems, or approach the problem from many different angles. Those, and even breaking down a big problem into smaller pieces. It just seems like when you're in my experience, when you're tinkering with things like that and experimenting with the physical world, it really puts practicality down. It's easy to get lost in our minds about things and go in tangents and directions, but there's a real, like, how do I make this thing work if I'm in the physical world tinkering with things?
I think part of that, just to elaborate on that a bit, I think part of that is also a byproduct of upbringing. He grows up in the Midwest. He grows up in Michigan. The town he grows up in, Gaylord, is a town that's core business is making things. It's in lumber. So he's constructing, makeshift elevators in his backyard and primitive communications devices with his friends. But he's in a place, and of a place that, say, maybe a little bit distinct from Manhattan. They've got space and they build things and he builds things. And so part of this is certainly a byproduct of this kind of Midwestern tinker tradition. And there is a pretty powerful tradition of those people then going, to the coast, whether to Silicon Valley to build modern technology, or to the East Coast to be a part of, either the defense establishment at the time or prestigious universities. But he is firmly of his place. He is a kind of son of Michigan in that way, where he has this hard-headed practicality that infuses his entire career. And it's one of the reasons that we spent a lot of time looking at what was his life like when he was a boy. Who were his ancestors? What did he do at the University of Michigan? Because I think it's impossible to tell the Shannon story without appreciating that part of his upbringing.
Thank you. Love that. Really big influence. Seemed like his father was a big influence on him, if I remember correctly. Is that fair?
Yeah. Shannon's father was pretty old when Shannon was born. So there's a bit of an age gap, and I don't think they had a super close mentoring kind of relationship. But at the same time, this tinkering that Shannon picked up as a big part of his life, was really a part of his family going back several generations. I think his grandfather invented an early patent for a washing machine. Sort of not the washing machine, but this was a time when there were lots of different ideas for how to mechanically agitate clothes in water were sort of percolating, and Shannon's grandfather happened to do one of those. His dad was a local figure, local businessman who also did a lot of work with his hands in Upper Michigan. And this is sort of the kind of rural do-it-yourself community that Shannon grew up in. He was just had aside from school, which he did pretty well at, but nothing like, he wasn't sort of marked for greatness at an early age. Aside from that, he had a ton of unstructured time to tinker and play and make stuff. And the best example we found in the early days in the biography was this barbed wire telegraph system that he rigged up between his house and his friend's house, in which they could communicate and send telegraph messages to one another using the barbed wire fence that ran between their two properties as a conductor for the electrical signals. So, again, Shannon wasn't the only kind of kid doing this at the time in sort of the early 20th century, 1910s, 1920s, but he really benefited from a culture that let kids experiment and play and have a lot of unstructured time to figure these things out. And also a culture that, he grew up, not quite on a farm, but he grew up in a rural centered community. that made a lot of time and space for people tinkering and working with their hands, because that's just sort of an important part of the economy and the way of life. But the other thing that was lucky about the time and place that Shannon was in was that not only did he come out of this community, he was then able to benefit from institutions like University of Michigan, a public university, and MIT, which was ramping up its engineering program at the time, that really brought a lot of talent out from places like Upper Michigan, like Claude Shannon, and gave them the resources, the organization, and the mentorship they needed to lay the groundwork of this tremendous mid 20th century boom in science and innovation that shaped the U.S. in so many different ways. So in a lot of ways, it's this really fortuitous conjuncture of Shannon's upbringing, his background, and the fact that he's coming onto the scene right when there are a lot of institutions designed really to make the most of talents of people like him.
Perfect. One of the things that came up for me when you were talking about tinkering, I have sort of a similar background. And my grandfather ran the hardware store in a small farm town in Kansas. And
oh, cool.
So I kind of, my dad became an engineer and so on and so forth. But when you're tinkering on that level, you have what you have, meaning you can't just run out to Lowe's or Home Depot. And there's a certain make do with what you have kind of thing. And how can I, take what I've got to make this thing work? Again, just that practicality thing and learning how to think outside the box. Well, I need, to do this. What are the things that I can use to make that happen?
Yeah. And I think that's really, that was something he kept with him for his whole life. This sort of hands-on quality. And I think there's a lot of stuff to be learned also about how people think scientifically and where scientific innovation comes from. It's not just a head discipline, it's a very hands-on discipline. And then I think when people talk about what you mentioned about Shannon's intuitiveness, his ability to grasp problems in sort of single steps, his ability to just sort of get to the heart of something, a lot of that I think comes from the fact that he spent a lot of time practicing solving problems practically with his hands. Going back to that master's thesis, which is about the problem of how do you get this massive room-sized analog computer to operate. A lot of his major insights and steps came from first applying these questions of handwork that became brain work. But he didn't really recognize a sharp dividing line between those two things. And I think a lot of people who have had that experience and the kind of experiences you describe, have found that they aren't separate disciplines, and that a lot of times thinking in the process of working with hands can oftentimes be a route to insights, just sort of noodling over something that isn't. This is something that's really interesting and alien to me because, I'm an academic and I just read books for a living and I write books for a living. But I think there's a dimension to the kind of physicality of how Shannon thought and to the physicality of how he solved problems that's really productive, but also really interesting and absent in the way that I approach problems. So it's really something I could sort of relate to, not from experience, but from, that I can tell how that would be nice and helpful and productive, and how that was such an important part of Shannon's life, both from the way he described it, and from trying to do academic work really without that.
I would add one thing to what Rob said, not as a prescription, but as a description of Shannon's work. The other place where the physical and the theoretical and the mathematical mix is in his war work. So when he's at Bell Labs, they're doing, he's doing math, not for the sake of just doing math and publishing papers. He's doing it so that the U.S. military can more precisely target its munitions. And so there's almost always this through line of the physical and the digital mixing in his work. And it has very high stakes at Bell Laboratories. Now, he didn't actually like that work so much. He was a little bit dismissive of it. He thought the math wasn't super challenging. It was a universal opinion. A number of mathematicians at the time write about that, but it's still important. It's a part of his makeup. And you could see how someone like this would end up doing the kinds of things that he did, particularly later in his life, when he switches very much in the direction of building machines. He builds the world's first chess-playing computer. He, builds up, as we talked about, the world's first wearable device. He builds even things that are just for whimsy, a flame-throwing, a rocket-powered Frisbee, a chair elevator that takes him from the backyard of his home down to the lake on the property. He built this button in his kitchen, I guess, that if you pushed it, an index finger in his workshop would curl and make a little noise so that he knew that he was being summoned. I mean, thing after thing like this, where there's a clear sense that he isn't just going to be a machinist and he's not just a mathematician. He manages to blend the two in some really interesting ways.
I love the story about his work during the war and how, the math was kind of simple and repetitive. But what made it so great for me and what it reminded me of is when I was a kid, I grew up with the personal computer. We got Apple computers in our elementary school in like third grade, and there was different games like Oregon Trail. And there was one, and
classic.
I think it might have.
Oregon Trail's a classic. That's a defining thing of my childhood.
Yeah, and that's one of the, that and maybe Lemonade Stand are the two that I could really remember looking back. And then this talk about his work, Shannon's work in the World War, I guess it was World War II, reminded me of, we used to play a game called Artillery, where it's just like you had a target and you had a gun and you had to kind of calculate the angle and maybe the I forget, there was just a few variables. But we would spend hours just playing that and taking great delight in that.
Yeah, I spent hours, and I think I still bemoan all the oxen meat that I couldn't take with me, right, or whatever it was. No, it was buffalo. It was like, but you'd kill the buffalo, but you had a max on the amount of meat you could take, and you'd successfully, felled all these things that could be valuable, but the game had a limit on what you could take back. But more seriously, I think that one of the things that I always take away from Shannon's life and work is, we're very instrumental sometimes in the things that we pursue, right? We want to take on a hobby, and I'm as guilty. By the way, I'm like patient number one. Like I'm as guilty of this as anybody. But what his life argues for is for allowing a certain amount of your curiosity to just pursue an end without a specific, ROI in mind. One of the things that makes him amazing is that he is willing to just decide to do something, pursue it, and see what results without any kind of he's not posting pictures of, he had this tree in his property and he decided that he was going to cut it down, but then he changed his mind and decided, I'm going to carve it into a pole with a skull at the very top, and I'm going to hang a pirate flag from it. But he's not doing that so he gets a very cool Instagram photo and a bunch of likes. He's just doing it because he's curious about whether he could do it and how cool it would look if it was done. And I think there is something to that can be a corrective to like just a lot of how we work, a lot of how we live. He was somebody that did these things that we are still talking about decades later, but it wasn't as though he was doing them with the intention that we would be talking about them decades later.
Right, following your curiosity. It seemed to be a big part of what he was about, and in a time when maybe curiosity wasn't exactly valued. There was the phrase usefully irritated that he talked about in driving him and what he chose to pursue. Do you talk about useful irritation?
Yeah, I think he mentioned this in his talk on creativity. As sort of when something just sort of bothers you, that is incomplete, or there's a problem there that you can't quite put your finger on, but it's stimulating you towards that's not quite right. I can do better, and that's behind a lot of Shannon's success in a lot of different fields. But I think about it particularly behind his work on information theory. It grew out of some very technical problems. The problems that the Bell system had in sending relatively lossless telephone messages across this giant national and then intercontinental network of telephone wires. So of all the people in the U.S. who are concerned with questions of information compression, encoding, decoding, safe transmission, Bell was probably at the forefront of this just because they had to be. And the problem that Shannon was drawn into was the problem of how can you encode information safely to make sure that you can have it transmit perfectly from sender to receiver. This idea, as we described it in the book, that you can actually have perfect 100% accurate or accurate to whatever degree of accuracy you choose to invest in information transmission In the book we described as sort of a utopian thought. No one really thought this was possible, that you could do this. And I think one of the things that irritated Shannon, was people thinking this, thinking that there was no theoretical way to transmit information with perfect accuracy or with indefinitely good accuracy, to be more technical about it. And that was one of the sort of irritants that got him thinking on this. People, when they read his paper, described it as this revelation because he did some things that no one had really thought possible before. Of course, in reality, that there's very little need for that kind of perfectly accurate information transmission. The kind of information that we send digitally, we have on phone calls, cell phone calls, Zoom chats, sending files over the internet. There's room for slightly less than 100% accuracy. What Shannon said is theoretically, information transmission can be as accurate as you want, provided that you spend the time encoding your information correctly. And one of his big insights in that work on encoding information was that the key to accurate information transmission wasn't sending out the signal with more energy behind it, just sort of shouting louder, as we described in the book. It actually has everything to do with how your messages are encoded, so that codes, the way it is coded in a sense, can act as a buffer that can absorb distortion or noise along the way from sender to receiver, with the essential message still getting through correctly. So this idea that Shannon had, that the key to accurate transmission of information was the way we encode our information, not how loudly we shout it, was a big moment and a big breakthrough in the history of thinking about these topics. And again, it came out of this very practical irritation, this idea that there is a practical problem that Bell Labs was trying to solve, and Shannon wasn't really satisfied the way that people were solving it up to that point.
Yeah, that's what really struck me as a big realization as I was going through the book and learning about Shannon is just, the classic problem I think of is when there's maybe a language barrier between two people. And so, people's natural tendency for some reason is to talk louder in order to somehow overcome that language barrier. But in fact, Shannon would say that you need to up your redundancy. So that seemed to be the secret. And instead of increasing the signal to overcome the noise is to add redundancy to your communication. Completely changed my perspective on how things work.
Yeah, I think that's really that's a good way of putting it. And I think that was it was a big moment in lateral thinking. And this idea that rather than just sort of extrapolating the kind of solution that people had developed up to that point, he attacked the problem in a completely different way. That again, in retrospect, about a half century later, can seem more than a half century now, can seem obvious or can seem intuitive, but certainly was not at the time.
It seems obvious now, right? And it probably at the time, it just, until he applied these mathematical models to what they were doing, it just didn't come out until you start playing with the math. So it's one way where the abstract mathematical can lead to real world solutions really quickly. All right. Well, Jimmy, you had something?
Yeah, I was also going to say, I think the other contribution is that he created the field, right? So he kind of came in and said, here are the key questions, here are some ideas, here are some of my answers. But he also set on fire a generation of researchers in this space who would take his insights and advance them. I think that's one really important thing that we learned, because we had the good fortune of interviewing a lot of those people, and they credit their lives and careers to Shannon.
Yeah, the word proof of concept was put out earlier in this discussion, and it seemed like that was kind of, he would put out these big picture concepts of how these things worked, and then kind of left it to everybody else to fill in the details. At least that's one of the things I got out of it. All right, are there, as we wrap up here, is there anything, what's the question you've always wanted to be asked about Claude Shannon, but were never asked?
Oh boy. Geez.
I think you should ask us about the funeral. Or the funeral.
Well, that's a good one. Yeah.
So the question is tell us, he had an idea of the funeral he wanted to have, or some kind of vision for a funeral? Is that? I remember reading about that recently, but
Yeah, Jimmy, do you have that? This is something that you sort of dug up, I believe, in your research.
Yeah. It was one of these funny things of you sort of see his grim sense of humor because buried within his papers at the Library of Congress is this plan for his own funeral. And what he wants is a parade. He has a series of floats that he's drawn. He has a computer playing chess against a human. He has a bunch of robots. There's a whole series of other things. But it was really funny because, we had a good interaction with the Shannon family throughout. And the one thing they were a little queasy about is, look, like Dad had this sense of humor that, may not come across well, but it says something powerful about him. I think that even in his plan for his death, the focus wasn't on will and testament or assets. It was, let me make the most humorous funeral I possibly can, or at least sketch it out. Now, I don't believe that's the way they went, but I think maybe the thought counts for.
But I do think that one nice piece is that I on the back of his tombstone in Mount Auburn Cemetery in Massachusetts is his the key information from the equation from his information theory paper. So that little bit of his legacy is still there for people who know what that equation means in the back of his tombstone.
well, it seems like your research into Claude Shannon has brought two gems that we ought to pay more attention to. One being the funeral procession, because I just read about that last night, and I was kind of I was trailing off at the end of my reading, but I have to go back. It was quite the scene that he painted for his funeral. But then this kind of little known 6 steps for problem solving that you folks discovered in your research is just absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, thank you so much. And that part is especially great, I think, because this is someone who just he walked the walk. He wasn't just he was not making it up. This is very much directly from his experience as one of the most successful problem solvers of his time.
Awesome. Well, any final words or anything you'd like to share with us? How to find you? Maybe your next project?
I think one of the things that we should mention is, in addition to checking out our book, A Mind at Play, about Shannon, there's a great documentary that was done by a director named Mark Richardson called The Bit Player. And I would encourage people to check that out as well.
I will make sure we link to that in the show notes. And I will, again, give a shout out to your book. I really enjoyed it. Really.
Thanks so much.
It was educational, helped me understand, the details of integrated circuit design using algebra and also communications theory, as well as several other technical things that you got into. But it also just painted that picture of such a curious and interesting character.
Well, thanks a lot for having us on to talk about it. It's always a pleasure to talk about Claude Shannon.
All right, great.
Well, thank you very much.
That concludes our episode. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Thank you to Rob Goodman and Jimmy Soni for taking the time to chat. Check out all the links in the show notes to learn more. And thank you to Christina Pearson and Richard Rassa of Hilaritas Press. Thank you to engineer Ryan Reeves for putting it all together. Our next episode, releasing the 23rd of December, will feature Oz Fritz discussing the intersection of magic and literature in Raw's writing. Until then, I am your host, Mike Gathers, signing off with love and cheerfulness. Amor et hilaritas. Hilaritas.